So I think we're going to go over a couple of the early games that were played in the first 2 rounds of the Grand Chess Tour in Croatia. So we'll go over these first 2 rounds. Okay, so the first game that we're going to go over is the game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. So the game goes d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, bishop g5, bishop g7, knight d2, and here so Shakhriyar basically plays something along the lines of like a Tory system, or a Tory attack I should say. You can put the knight on d2 or c3 potentially, but white tries to push for e4 in the center immediately. So Maxime castles, which is the first big surprise, because normally Maxime, being a Grunfeld player, will always push a pawn to d5 here to prevent white from claiming the big center. Here Maxime castles, e4 is played, d5 played by Maxime, trying to strike in the center right away here. And now Shakhriyar takes, which is kind of interesting. You could play e5, but after e5, knight e4, there's some issues here. If you trade the knights, your knight is under attack, and your center pawns are very weak. If you move the knight back, for example, black can play c5, and there are a lot of problems with your pawn chain here. And if the diagonal ever opens up, this bishop will become very strong, aiming towards the rook on a1. So here Shakhriyar takes on d5. Maxime takes with the knight. c3 is played. Now the point behind c3 is white tries to build a pawn chain here in the center of the board and blunt the ideas of this bishop on g7. For example, let's say you go c5 and takes occurs. You'll notice that with the 2 pawns, the bishop doesn't really have any threats because this pawn is in the way. This pawn on c3 is in the way of the pawn on b2, for example. So like you go back here, if I'm moving, you get c5. If I were to take, then the bishop can take the pawn on b2. So it's very, very important that by building this chain of 3, that even if black gets rid of the pawn here at the top, you still have 2 pawns behind, which prevent the bishop from attacking on the diagonal. So after c3, Maxime plays knight d7. Shakhriyar goes bishop to c4. Knight b6 is played here by Maxime. Shakhriyar plays bishop b3. Now, one thing that you would notice here is that normally when white gets a chain like this of 3, white puts the bishop on d3. But in this case, if you go bishop d3, after pawn to c5, there's a lot of pressure on your center. If you trade the pawns, after knight takes c5, the bishop on d3 is under attack. You'll have to waste time moving it backwards. And now after something like queen b6, for example, there's a lot of pressure here aimed at your queen side. So instead he goes bishop c4, knight to b6 is played, now bishop b3 played. And the great thing is this is a very positional game where really what it comes down to is white has awesome bishops. You've got great scope on this diagonal towards the king on g8. You also have great scope on this other diagonal towards the queen on d8. So the 2 bishops are really well placed. And what black really is playing for here is black needs to push a pawn in the center. White has much more space, or if you can get castle and go rook e1, there's a lot of pressure. So if you're Shakhriyar, you're looking to finish your development with castles, but mainly you're focused on preventing black from being able to attack the center with one of these pawn pushes from c7 or e7. So bishop f5 is played. Shakhriyar castles. Rook c8 played by Maxime. Again, trying to strike the center with pawn to c5. Rook e1 is played here, exactly following the plan of putting pressure on the e7 pawn. h6 is played, and now bishop h4, and c5 played by Maxime. Again, as I said, the problem for black here is black is lacking space in the center of the board. You have some knights here, but you don't have any pawns here. So because of that, in this position, it's really imperative that you try to attack the center. So otherwise, white has much more space and will be able to use that space to claim a very big advantage. So Maxime plays c5. Is there a known line to strike the center? Well, you can play a different opening. But c5 is played here. So pawn takes pawn. Let me close this for a second. So pawn takes pawn is played. Rook takes pawn. h3 played by Shakhriyar. Now this is kind of an interesting move. I don't know if I like it. I don't really understand what it does even here. To me, it would seem much more logical to try and play something like knight e4. Now, mind you, knight e4 here, there are some issues because I think black can trade and maybe go g5 here. If you go bishop g3, there might be some idea like f5 and f4 to trap this light square bishop or dark square bishop on g3. So there might be some issues. That being said, computer still doesn't really buy it and thinks that white has an advantage. That being said, it's a rapid game, hard to play moves like this. So h3 is played, which I think kind of gives back a lot of the advantage here because black can maybe look to play g5 and knight f4. It also doesn't feel like it really improves your position other than creating the luft for the king on h2. So g5, bishop g3, knight f4 is played, and now Shakhriyar goes knight e4. Very nice move, trying to put this knight in the center, attack the rook, but also clearing the way so that you can recapture the queen for the queen on d1 with the rook and take the open d file. Again, if you look at this position, let's say black trades, the white rooks are on the perfect squares here. The rook on d1 is on an open file, completely open here, and the rook on e1 is on a half open file, aiming potentially at the pawn on e7 if you can move the knight out of the way. So rook c8 is played here. Knight to d4 played by Shakhriyar. Bishop to g6 played by Maxime. Now here Shakhriyar takes on f4, pawn takes bishop, queen to g4. Very important move here, and I suspect that Maxime just blundered this because now the problem is that your bishop on g6 is actually under attack here. So say you play a random move like a6, white can go queen takes bishop, and you cannot capture the queen because then white would capture your king on g8 due to the pin. So you can't really push the pawn. At the same time, your king is kind of open here. Again, you push these pawns in front of your king, and now there is not much coverage. So for example, say you take on e4. After rook takes e4, there are threats like knight to f5 attacking the bishop on g7. Your f4 pawn is weak. Say you move the king here, white can even go bishop c2, angling on the diagonal to create mate threats like a battery. So therefore, in this position, Maxime goes king h7. Shakhriyar plays rook a d1. Another important move, you don't want to play queen takes pawn at f4 because after pawn to e5, your queen and your king get forked, and you're going to lose at least a knight here. The rook d1 is played. Again, very good move by Shakhriyar. Look at these rooks. Perfect placement on the two center files. The knights are right in the center of the board. They're looking to jump every which way here. Additionally, the pawn on f4 is weak. Your bishop targets the pawn, and the queen on g4 is also creating many threats. So it's very, very nice. You make this all look so easy and obvious after you explain it and go 6 moves deep. LOL. Well, that's why chess is such a difficult game, because it's like, and it's difficult even for players at the top, because there are a lot of times that when we look at it with computers, our own games, during the game we're like, it doesn't make sense, but then when we use the computer, we're like, oh man, it's so obvious, why couldn't we figure it out? So it's not just you guys, it goes both ways. Even for top players, it's the same thing. We look at it and we're like it's like it seems so difficult, and then we use the computer and we're like, oh man, we're just bad at chess. So yeah, so rook d1 is played here. Bishop takes d4 played by Maxime. Rook takes d4. Maxime goes queen c7. Again, even material black is guarding the pawn on f4. That being said, king on h7 is very airy, and there are definitely a lot of problems. So queen h4 is played here. The idea, I think, behind queen h4 is to potentially target the pawn on e7 here. Additionally, you might be able to move the knight to g5 or back to d2. I think, for example, now this doesn't happen in the game. King g7 is played, but you could even consider a move like knight d2, creating a double attack on f4 and e7 at the same time. Mind you, in this position it doesn't work, but just as an example. So king g7 is played by Maxime. G3 played here by Shakhriyar, and now f3 played. G4 played. I don't know if I love g4, but I think the idea behind g4 is white just wants to go knight g3 and maybe knight f5 or knight h5, and there still are a lot of threats towards the pawn on e7, and long term this pawn on f3 should be a little bit weak. So rook f d8 is played here. Now here Shakhriyar goes g5. Very nice move, trying to rip open the protection of the black king here. Rook h8 is played by Maxime. Knight g3 played here. Again, idea that essentially all these pawns are very loose. So it's like, for example, e7 is very loose here. f7 is kind of loose. This rook can also lift to g4, f4, and your queen is very well placed on h4. So even though it doesn't look like it's much here, it's very bad for black, because you essentially have 3 pieces that are doing nothing. This knight in particular is completely blocked here. It can't get into the game, so it's gonna have to reroute to like d7 and e5, and it doesn't. Even d7 here, for example, would hang this pawn at e7. So basically you have a knight that's completely dominated by this light square bishop. You can't jump. Additionally, the bishop targets f7, and the rook and the queen are also out to lunch. So queen c5 is played here, and now knight to h5 played by Shakhriyar. King to f8 is played. Not bishop takes knight, because after queen takes knight, if black were to think, okay, I can take the pawn, we have to trade queens because your king is in check here, so you have to take. White actually is a very nasty move, rook to g4, and black would be unable to capture the queen on h5 because the rook would capture the king on g7. So you can't actually play queen takes g5. And additionally, after queen h5, there are many threats here. You're hitting f7, which is a checkmate. Let's say black goes rook f8 to guard the pawn. You then create the fossil with pawn takes pawn check, and after black captures, you just swing over and capture the queen on c5 here. So therefore, king to f8 is played by Maxime. Knight to f4 played by Shakhriyar. Another move that I think is very nice. You kind of wonder, well, after knight f4, can't black just take and trade into an endgame where he's doing fine? But the problem is, after black takes, we trade queens. White takes on g6, black takes back, and here white has a very nice move, rook to d3, an all-star move, because in this position, if black tries to capture the pawn at h3 to guard against the threat of on f3. White now is bishop to e6, which hits both the rook on h3 and the rook on c8. So instead, Maxime plays rook c5, blundering this very nice move, just rook d8 check. And after you move the king to g7, here Maxime resigns. And he resigns in view of the fact that if you move the king to g7, after rook takes e7, if you go king h6, there's rook h8 checkmate. King has no squares here because the rook covers everything. And if you go king f6, white can very simply go rook to f7 check, king to e5, rook takes h8, and white has an extra tower here, and the game is over. So very nice game by Shakhriyar. Maybe not perfectly played, but more than enough in a rapid game, and very educational, I think, because what you learn here is that if you don't get a part of the center in games, it's very hard to play a lot of these positions. For example, you'll notice that there's another opening that's comparable, which is the Aliekin's defense, and you get positions like this. And sometimes if you're not careful, you can end up much worse because white has more of the center. So that's the first game I want to go over. The second game we're going to go over is the game between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Shakhriyar. So c4 played here, knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3 castles, d4, d6, e4 here played by Jan. So we get a classic King's Indian, the fianchetto variation with bishop g3 and bishop g2. As everybody knows, when you put the bishop inside the nest like this, it's fianchettoing it. All right. So e5 is played here. Knight g to e2 played by Nepomniachtchi. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Rook to e8 played here. White castles. Black goes knight b to d7. Pawn to h3. Now the idea behind h3 is sort of twofold. First of all, it stops knight from going to g4. Secondly, because you might want to put up bishop b3, it also creates space for your king. And additionally, down the road, you might even try to push your pawns like f4, g4, g5, f5, and pawn storm. So h3 supports the pawn thrust on g4. So a6 is played here by Shakhriyar. Rook to e1 played by Jan. Logical move, guards the pawn against threats like knight c5, trying to capture it. Rook to b8 played. Bishop to e3. Knight to e5 played here. And now pawn to b3, protecting the pawn on c4. c5 played by Shakhriyar. Again, very similar kind of position, by the way. You'll notice that white has a grip on the center here. This is what we traditionally call like a Maroczy bind. Now, mind you, Maroczy bind refers more to Sicilian positions where black is a pawn like on e7 versus c7 d6. Normally, it's the other way. It's like e7 d6, like this versus this. But it is relatively playable. I'm speaking too fast. I'm so sorry, dude. Okay. So c5 is played here by Shakhriyar. Knight d to e2 played in this position, and the idea after knight d to e2 here is that basically white wants to put pressure on the backwards pawn on d6. So b5 played here by Shakhriyar, trying to strike at the center here. Let's say white were to trade pawns. Black actually has a lot of play, and the reason is that black can go b4 and bishop b7 and put a lot of pressure on this e4 point. Additionally, there might be ideas like, for example, say I make some random moves like, I don't know how to do it exactly, but how do I do it? Some random position where there might even be a pawn push to d5, attacking the pawn at e4. So after b5, f4 is played, Shakhriyar goes knight e to d7. And here, Jan takes the pawn on d6. And basically, with Jan taking on d6, he asks Shakhriyar, what is your plan? Because if black doesn't have a plan immediately, say black develops a bishop, after pawn to e5, you're close to lost here, simply due to the fact that white is a pawn chain that's protected, and your knight is going to have to go to the rim, and you're just down one pawn here. So black has to come up with some tactics immediately, which is very regular for it's very common. It's a common theme in King's Indians and the Ben Onis, where you have to create tactics to deal with the fact that you have a bad pawn structure. The b4 is played here. Now Jan plays the e5, pawn takes knight, knight takes pawn. Very interesting move, by the way, not pawn takes knight, which is probably not a great move because after rook e3, pawn takes bishop, apparently black can go rook b6 according to the computer, and it's winning. And I guess that's because after queen d1, you can get a double stack, and you can do the double and then line up the legendary triple stack, and you have passed pawn that's dangerous, and white has these rooks and this queen that are stuck on the first rank. So the legendary triple here would be deadly. So therefore, knight takes c3 is played by Jan. Now knight h5 is played. Pawn to g4, bishop to f8, queen to d2. Knight to g7, knight d5, and black is up a piece here. Black is an extra knight for 2 pawns, but the problem is that white controls so much of the center. You can go rook d1 here. Your rooks are well placed. There might be a pawn push to f5. Your knight is also threatening to jump to all kinds of squares near the black king. So f6 played here. Rook a d1, fe5, f5. Another very, very nice move by Jan, showing full understanding of the position and realizing that when you look at the position, you'll see that black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces on the back rank of the board, and even the knights don't really have squares here. Like if you look at this knight, it can't go anywhere. So this knight is boxed in. This knight can't really go here because there's always going to be some bishop g5 threat with knight f6. So black has all these pieces on the original rank, and you can't do anything with your knights either. So all of black's pieces are passive here. So bishop b7 is played. Bishop g5, queen to c8, and now Jan goes rook f1. Another nice move. Simple idea to play pawn to f6 and pawn to f7 to fork the king and the rook here. And it's already, I think, close to loss simply due to the lack of activity. Black's pieces are just going nowhere in a hurry. So he takes, Jan takes, king to h8 played here, and now Jan plays f6, knight to e6, f7, attacking the rook on e8. Shakhriyar goes rook d8. Now here's a very critical point where basically if white were to take the rook on d8 after black takes, white is still slightly better, but it's very hard to play because black is going to go queen to h4, bishop to h6, get the rook to f8, and additionally black also has a bastion here on d4 for the knight to jump to. So you don't necessarily want to trade back the material here, because in this position your bishop is very active, and if you take, you help black untangle here in the long run. So knight to b6 is played here by Jan. Knight takes knight, and now bishop to f6, which is again a very nice move. Bishop to g7 is played here. Jan plays queen takes rook. If black were to play knight takes queen, you can now go f8, and just for the memes, you can go pawn to f8 rook, and it's just checkmate. Black cannot capture the rook, so I would capture a king, and the king can't go anywhere. So it's just game over here. Of course, you could also make a queen. So Shakhriyar takes with the queen. Jan takes with the bishop. Again, black cannot really do much. If you take with the knight, I make a queen. We trade. King comes up, and then I just take the knight. And you'll see that white has a bishop and 2 rooks. Black has a rook, a bishop, and a knight. So instead, bishop takes g2 is played here. King takes g2. Knight to f8 played by Shakhriyar, trying to survive here. Now, if you look at the material count, white has 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns. Black has, or 5 pawns, sorry. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, and black has a knight and a bishop for a rook. So by material, it's actually the count is even. But due to this very, very advanced pass pawn on f7, combined with this bad knight on b6, and the fact that knight on f8 is also tied down, can't really move from the f8 square, it's close to winning for white. So bishop e7 played by Jan. Knight to d7, rook to d6. Again, you'll notice the knights are really boxed here. This knight can't move, so you lose that knight. This knight can't really go anywhere either, or not in a hurry. So the knights are really in bad shape here. The rook and the bishop are doing some amazing work. So e4 played by Shakhriyar with the idea to maybe move a bishop and get your king into the game. Jan goes rook e1. Now I don't know if this is the absolute best move, because after bishop d4, rook e4, king g7, black starts to get the king into the game. So rook takes a6, king takes f7, bishop d6 played here, and now rook to c8 is played by Shakhriyar. Rook to e7, king g8, and rook a7. Again, we're not going to see perfect play because this is a rapid game. Players are getting low on time and mistakes will happen. But you can tell that basically white's going to start pushing this pawn down the board. And again, black doesn't really have squares for the knight. Like if you had some pawns here, say there was a pawn on g5, you could maybe jump to f4. But with no pawns and no outposts for the knights anywhere, white is just completely winning. So he goes knight f6, rook g7, king h8, rook b7, knight e4, and now rook to b8. A very nice move, forcing an endgame here, or trading off the rook, which is it's the most powerful piece on the board that black has left. Black takes the bishop, you trade the rooks, you go rook a8, and black is going to lose one of the knights. If you move this knight, you lose this one. If you move this one, you just lose that one. So knight d6 is played, rook f8, king g7, rook to 8. Very, very simple, clean idea, which is just go 1, 2, 3, 4. Basically 1, 2, 3, 4, move the rook and make a grill at the end of the board. So Shakhriyar goes bishop c3, a4, and now he tries knight b7, the one last grip. So for example, say this king was on g6 here. Black would actually be close to fine here, because what black could actually, let's just say knight a5. Black could be close to fine here, because if you get to a position like this, you'll notice that the bishop actually holds the knight and the pawn holds the bishop, and the knight can actually take the pawn. And additionally, white can't push this pawn because it's blockaded. So if black could get this formation, black is close to being okay. Mind you, white still has an advantage, but it's playable. However, after knight b7, black is one move too slow because white goes rook a7, and after rook a7, the knight is pinned. You can't move the knight because then you would lose your king. And if you move your king, I just take the knight, and it's pretty straightforward. King f5, rook b5, king e6, a5, king d6, a6, king c6, a7. Pawn gets the end of the board. White makes a queen, and that's game over. So very, very impressive win from Jan. Very good understanding of the initiative and playing with the initiative. And this is why I've said many times, if Jan can get out of the opening with initiative against Magnus in their world championship match, he has very good chances. But if he doesn't get that, I mean that's really going to be the question. Can he get that or not when they play each other? Because if he can get games like this where he gets like free-flowing openings which are dynamic and aggressive, he will have a good chance against Magnus. But if he can't get those, like, that initiative and that attack out of the opening phase, I think Magnus will have a big advantage and be a big favorite. So that's what I would say. All right, you guys, so that's just a recap that I'm going to do of these games, of the games from this first day of the Grand Chess Tour event. We will go back to see if there are any games still going currently. I think there are some games still going. Okay, we have Anisha's game. We have 3 draws, and let's put Jordan's game on the big board. Let me change the scene. So we'll keep Jordan's game on the big board. Looks pretty balanced so far. Nothing too crazy is happening. We have Anish versus Ivan Sarge. Now, Anish is better. We have the classic Capablanca setup here where this bishop on g3 should be dead.